This is Basket Case Clubs, CPR Group's podcast where we turn basket case clubs into showcase clubs. G'day everyone and welcome back to Basket Case Clubs. My name's Michael Connolly and it is my pleasure to once again be your host on this journey of basket casey goodness. Joining me, not as usual, is my colleague and friend Mark Fox. Mark, this is the bit that I've been looking forward to. I get to say welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Welcome, everyone.
It is our pleasure to have you. So give us a bit of a spiel, Mark. Where do you fit in?
I'm reasonably new.
No, I mean, where do you fit in life? Like, because I don't fit in anywhere.
Oh, right. I fit in a number of different places. I'm a father of 4 young children, 8 to 12. I am a town planner, which I'm no doubt we'll talk about. I am a sports lover, love playing squash, volunteer, player, coach, and just general dad. Get around the netball facility as well, because I've got 3 girls as well, but also my son plays netball as well. So a very busy person generally.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, and I was hoping you'd say long-time listener, first-time caller. Because Mark's been listening to Basket Case Club since before he joined our team at CPR Group, haven't you?
Yes, I have a little
now,
bit.
Now, this is, truth serum. How many episodes have you listened to?
More about the
Just
money.
enough to get the job.
Yeah, I forgot to delay there to wait for you to say something. I've listened to about 3 or 4, and usually, like I said to you earlier, it's when we're doing a long drive. I sit on a couple of committees as well outside of my work. So yeah, usually the AGM series and a couple of others, I've learned some stuff along the way.
So all of the stuff that we talk about when we say the funny things that clubs do and the silly things that clubs do, how much of that have you been able to relate to?
Yeah, yes, I sort of have to swallow a little bit sometimes when I hear things. And yeah, it's when you say it, I can say, yes, I understand that, but you know, there's always a little bit of a but, because it's tough to hear,
yeah.
You know, some of the conversations
yeah.
you have.
And you're not the first person to say something like, I felt called out. I felt like, oh my God, that's exactly what we do. And like being a fly on the wall in some of those situations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the banter along the way is pretty handy. So.
Yes, yeah. And don't steal the jokes though, because they ain't no good.
Fair enough.
So I think Steve and I try and have a dad joke off. You have to be careful how you say that, don't you? So we're here to talk about your role as a town planner. Yep. So town planning is, how do you define town planning? And what's the difference between town planning and urban planning?
Well, why put me in that corner? Why try to make me say that? I like to think that town planning is probably like other professions. It's a way of thinking. And obviously it's about the uses on a site, how they work with surrounding uses, planning for now and in the future, and in a sustainable way. So it can be very micro in some senses, when they're looking at the built form and how that interacts, or you know, the urban form, but it can be that wider consideration around the demographics and that longer term projection.
In a lot of cases, and this is certainly the case in sport, it seems like there's an understanding by some people on committees when they get almost sideswiped by the fact that they need to go through a town planning process, because in thinking about planning for sport, clubs might have great strategic plans and great ideas about the future, and those plans include grand plans for facility developments and upgrades, but they haven't considered that from a town planning perspective. So there's obviously a planning scheme that says some things can be built in certain places and in certain ways and others can't, for some of those macro and micro reasons that you talk about. So some of the site-specific stuff might be overland flow paths or vegetation or evidence of fauna movements on a site that mean that that site has some important values that need to be protected. And it's sometimes like they just feel like they've sideswiped by town planning. Have you seen, in your role as a planner, did you feel ever that town planning is not necessarily a way to be saying no or a way to stop development, but rather a way to make sure that the development that we do today is sensitive for the future and the long term?
Yeah, I mean, with sport facility planning, I think it's about being aware of those surprises that could happen, that could really derail the future of, your organization. So whether that's just generally around, the zoning of the site or the overlays, you might be looking to bring in other types of uses, ancillary uses that support bringing in some money for your club or diversifying in different ways. You might be thinking about opening another access or more car parking, or you've got lighting spillage, or you've got complaints happening from neighbours, or other uses. So I suppose it's understanding what provisions, whether they're the planning scheme or their estate, or whatever permits there are on that site. So usually a planning scheme informs those kind of things, and what you can work within the boundaries. And they usually work in hand with state sporting facility requirements as well. There are cases that I've seen already in my short term here that they do conflict, and that's usually where you need to sit down with, council and the state organisation about, well, which one, comes in here. Someone's saying you need a parking rate of this versus a parking rate of this. You need, so many toilet elements versus another. So, there are those conflicts, but again, it's about not being surprised. If you're planning for the future of your club and you're very fixated around going 2 stories for a clubhouse or putting another 3 courts on a site, what does that mean? Does that mean that you then need another 50 car parks? Does it mean that you need another couple more change rooms? But also, what is the council thinking about in terms of the future of your facility? They're probably thinking, well, there's a lot of downtime on that site. We want to make this a multi-use facility. We want to introduce another lease arrangement for another sport. So you need to bring in those other stakeholders, and that's ultimately where some of that planning discussion takes place.
Just as you were talking, then some of the triggers for planning coming into these discussions have been things like light spill. So it's all well and good to say, well, we want new lights, but those lights might be going on a second field that has never been lit before. So all of a sudden there's a planning assessment that needs to happen there to make sure that it's not going to adversely impact other land uses around the site. The other one that always comes up, though, is that when you look at the historical development of most sporting facilities, they were built in a time when urban densification wasn't anywhere near where it is now. And so there are some things that are really sorely lacking. And I'm thinking to particularly some sites in close to the inner city Brisbane that just have almost no car parking. And if you were to rebuild now, the requirements for those extra 50 car parks would be, thank God we've got 50, but what are we doing about the other 150 if those change over time?
They were a former tip site, and then there's issues to consider in terms of building a substantial building on that site. So yeah, absolutely, those things come into play. And I mean, ultimately, traditionally, sporting land or recreational land is on constrained sites, usually from flood prone, with limited access, potentially not great visibility in terms of crime prevention or security. So you're usually dealing with a constrained site, and ultimately, yeah, there are some compromises that need to be made, but there are solutions around that. And whether that's thinking more broadly around car parking with adjoining sites, whether they're shopping centres, or whether you're thinking about flooding or overland flows. So whether you need to look at different car parking arrangements and not just impervious, but grass car parking solutions, or light spillage as well. There's different ways of arranging lighting or security lighting, whether it's sensory or not. So a lot of these things can be overcome. Sometimes it can be seen that by bringing in the planning legislation, or the planners coming in here, our list of things we need to do is just going to increase.
Yep.
But ultimately, I think in terms of getting those huge funding, being grant ready for bigger things, you're going to be asked these things, or you might finally successfully get that grant money and then you can't spend that in the end because the blowout of the costs instead of being 300,000, it's now 500,000, and you're not going to achieve that solution.
So, and that's some of the negativity that I hear regularly, is that everything was going fine and it was going to be a $300,000 project until council got involved, and then they introduced all of this red tape. And it's almost like the perception is that planning is put, like risk management. Risk management is put there to tell us why we can't do things, and planning is put there to tell us either why we can't do it or why it has to be double the price. But I've started thinking about it in a different light. And instead of saying risk management is there to say no and put barriers in front of us, risk management is there to say you've got an idea to do something, build something, make something, but everything great in life exists on the other side of risk. So risk management is the way that we manage our way through the things that we know, so that we get to, yes, you can do this. Being a space nerd, I often talk about the Apollo program. Now, think about all of the risks there, not least of which is the fact that we might be putting 3 blokes on the top of a ballistic missile and sending them up to a fiery death in space, very, very publicly. But then everything that works back from that, the reputation risk, the financial risk. But obviously at the time they thought that the Apollo program is worth that risk because of what we can learn from it and getting to the other side of it. So it's all just about risk management, mitigating as many as we can, getting rid of those that we can.
Yeah, I never thought I'd have a conversation related to town planning and Apollo, but we're definitely there. But I mean, the flip side as well, all planning schemes are different from local government to local government, and there are some local governments where planning schemes where sporting facilities don't trigger a planning application through their scheme. In others, they do, but ultimately in all cases, it's due diligence that you need to look at those requirements so that you're achieving your best practice on the site, and that those provisions are there to be put in place because of that risk assessment. So while a planning application is not required, it makes sense that you're considering the overland flow and the risks associated with that. Council's within their right to consider that as well, even though an application might not be required. So yeah, absolutely, due diligence, risk management.
Due diligence, risk management, I'm going to add stewardship, because when you look at our use of land, it's so easy to get stuck in the paradigm of the present. Does that make me sound smart, or does it make me sound like I'm dumb and trying to sound smart? It's when we look at what we want for today, I just want this built and I need it now, and we've got all of these members that we can't accommodate, so we just want that now. But planning makes you take that step back and say, but what about the long-term future? So when you talk about impervious versus pervious versus permeable surfaces for your car parking, now to a novice like me, that's, well, what difference does it make? But it actually makes a really big difference, because at the moment the rain can fall on that land and it's not just going to move straight into the house next door, because a lot of it will be able to soak in first. But if you put bitumen there, then all of that water, every time it rains, needs to go somewhere now. So that's a big impact. But that's now. The other thing is that the buildings that we're building when we're talking about sports facilities aren't necessarily going to be there or be the same in 100 years. So planning is trying to make sure that we've got that long-term view that says we are but short-term stewards. You can't wreck this land for future generations of people who are going to enjoy it for sport, but also future generations of the flora and fauna that exists there and has existed there for tens, hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think back recently we had a project where we were engaged through the state sporting organisation for a particular club, and they've been stuck in a planning paralysis. They were fixated on, they wanted to do a number of improvements on their site. And one of those was around increasing the size of one of their fields. Now that's surrounded by a highly constrained site. I think they had an easement on one side, environmental buffers, but they believed potentially through a couple of committees, ongoing time, going, yep, we can increase this, we just need to do these kind of things, but it never went anywhere. And through our engagement, we were able to just piece out all of those improvements they wanted to do, and we focused in on this extension, and we ultimately determined that it was too complex for them to achieve that. Highly unlikely, too complex, And we ruled that one out through a thorough process, looking at the planning requirements and the stakeholders involved. So, but that allowed them then to focus on their other elements of their improvements. And
So
ultimately,
rather than getting fixated on the stuff that we can't do, use this as a catalyst to say, okay, so these are the things that maybe from a stewardship perspective we shouldn't be doing anyway, and now let's focus our efforts on what we can do and how we can still maximise the value of this land for its contribution to physical activity.
yeah, and I mean, I've only had a short tenure here, but I've seen examples of that where you can have organisations or clubs fixated on a particular idea, whether it's one committee member or a certain politician that talking about that. But until that's really worked through, and then whether that sticks in the plan, or the strategic or the master plan, or it gets kicked out, it's only then that you know the idea can move forward. So hopefully, well, that's that element that I guess that planning brings to it, as well as you know the other roles that our company play as well.
So that this planning paralysis that this club has had has been going on for decades, hasn't it?
That's my belief.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my
So,
belief. Yeah.
so what do you think is it that has held them back from ever going far enough? Because once you got, as a planner, you can look at the site and you can say, well, I can leaf through this and I can say, these are the constraints, these are the things that in this particular council area are never going to fly because of the planning scheme, but also because the planning scheme is there to protect the environmental buffers you're talking about, the water courses that are nearby. That this is serious stuff. So they do have to, even the sorts of fertilizers and materials they're using for top dressing, they've got to be careful because they're in a riparian corridor. So what else is it, do you think, that has been holding them back from ever making that decision to say, well, let's do this properly, rather than just keep this internal and try and wonder what's possible? What do you think has stopped them from saying, let's go and find out for sure?
Well, aside from the things like you know, volunteers' time and money and things like that, yeah, I think making that potentially asking the question, how do we go about, you know, asking that, you know, that they could have picked up the phone and maybe had a conversation with their local council. Maybe they don't have a great relationship with their local council sport and rec officer or the planning department, and maybe they just had that one phone call that one time that really peed them off, and you went, you know what, stuff them. I reckon we can do that without them. The realities are you kind of need to get on with your local council in order to get this stuff done. So I think potentially it was a combination of that. You know, also too, there might be those elements, you know, in some committees where, you know, we can just get this stuff done ourselves, you know, old school wise.
Yep.
Let's just get the backhoe truck in and let's tip a bit of landfill here and there.
Yep.
You know, so, but when we're starting to think some of these bigger things where you know, you're bordering into, you know, environmental reserves or easements or state government land, obviously you've got some clear lease requirements you need to abide by. You need to, you know, do those checks and balances, and ultimately some of this stuff you can't achieve. So focus in on the things you can do and do them well.
Great. So this is now going exactly where I want to take you. What are the things that you think that clubs who are listening, as they're starting to plan these big picture developments, when do you think they should be starting to think from a planning perspective, and what steps can they take to start to bring some of these things that they need to know to light nice and early?
Well, potentially as early as possible. Like some of this stuff, you know, councils are pretty good these days around having their, you know, their constraints and their zoning requirements available on mapping systems online. Also, a lot of councils have, you know, either a front-facing planning section where they can go and talk to a planner or talk to, you know, a paraplanner or a technical officer in some degree. So, you know, having those initial conversations, and even if you might have had the minutes of, you know, 2 committees ago to say, oh no, we didn't get anywhere with that, it might be time to have a fresh perspective on that and just see, let's just double check what those requirements are. You know, talking to your local sport and recreation officer, like, don't be surprised that your sport and rec officer, you know, in some councils, they may be very well connected with the planning department, and other times they're not. So that initial conversation with your sport and rec department about who they suggest talking to, because they can ultimately be 2 different conversations. your sport and rec officer. They're potentially talking about their capital work program and things they can immediately do from an operational perspective for your club. But if you're thinking long-term plans, that the capital work program also needs to meet those zoning and overlay requirements and constraints around the site. Find out what they are, because there's no use sort of, pie dreaming about things if you're going to come up against barriers straight away.
So when I started in this role, the access to those online systems that you're talking about just didn't exist.
Well, I've shown you a few now, haven't you? Straight away.
Yeah. The accessibility of those systems is great. Most councils have them, and it gives you straight away access to all of the prospective overlays, all of the overlays that are going to affect this site. So do we have bushfire hazard? Do we have noise hazards? Do we have potential transport corridors running right through where we're going? And as you mentioned, we are dealing with constrained sites because they leave all the crap stuff for sport because nobody wants to live there and nobody wants to shop there, and it's not good enough for industrial development. So, and it's going to get wet, so we might as well make a football field. So that's typically what we do, which is fine. But this information is now accessible, but so are the people. And a really important point that you made is don't just rely on the minutes from 2 committees ago. Go and speak to the horse yourself. Get it from the horse's mouth, because if you are just relying on that, it's hearsay on hearsay. And who's to say that that interpretation was right?
Yep, absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
So as a squash player, Mark, what got you into planning?
Best sport in the world, isn't it?
Apparently so, yes.
It's in the Olympics, did you know that?
Yes, again.
Yeah, LA 28, and I'm sure it's going to be in 32.
Well, here's your time to plug. We'll see what we can do. What got you into planning?
I think, in high school, I enjoyed sort of report writing and graphics at the time and things like that. There was an angle towards architecture at some point, but ultimately I think someone just stood in front of me at one point at the right time and said the right things, and that university had squash courts. So I just went, oh, this is good. So that was the angle.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you can see why we call him Fantastic Mr. Fox. Mark, it has been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for your insights.
Thank you, Michael.
Any parting words of wisdom?
Play squash.
And here I was thinking it was going to be something about planning. Well done.
Thank you, Ralph.
Thanks, Mark.
Basket Case Clubs acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country on which we record, being Yugambeh, Turrbal, Jagera and Kabi Kabi land. We recognise their enduring connection to land, waters and culture, and pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to First Nations listeners.